Welcome to the Chiefs. Ako po si Roby Alampay. Kasama po natin online, Pamintuan of the Philippine Star, Luchi Cruz-Valdes of News 5. Chiefs, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Anong balita, Ami?
Well, inaabangan natin kung ano magiging reaction pa ng Beijing, no? Dahil tumuloy si US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi sa Taiwan. So far, mga verbal pa lang naman ng mga reaction.
And when you say...
Pero very awkward yung no? Yung
Yes.
pwesto ng Pilipinas.
Oh,
Yes.
yun nga eh.
Diba?
No comment.
Yun nga yung sasabihin ko. When we say na tayo, binabantayan pa natin, mismong ang Malacanang, binabantayan pa rin. And they're saying we'll have to take our cue from the Department of Foreign Affairs. And on that front, wala pa rin tayong nababalitaan. Wala pa tayong naririnig.
Yeah.
Ano pang binabantayan natin, Ami?
Well, siyempre may bago ng director ang Food and Drug Administration, no?
Oo.
Yes.
Yeah.
At yung personal doctor, well, he would understand about COVID, no? Kako-COVID lang ni President Marcos, eh.
Okay. And
Well, tama rin. Pwede natin tanungin yung guest natin ngayon.
Yes, yan ang segue mo.
What he has to say about it.
Kasama natin, suki natin sa Chiefs, Dr. Rontgene Solante, an infectious disease expert. Dr. Solante, welcome to the Chiefs.
Good evening.
Hi, Roby. Good evening, Ami and Luchi. Good evening.
Doc, we do, like we said, we do want to talk about two things, monkeypox, di ba? At the same time, itong bagong variant, sub-variant, bago na naman, di ko na alam kung ilan na, kung kaya niyo pang bilangin. But now we're talking about, ito ba yung Centaurus ba?
Centaurus.
Oh, Centaurus. What do we know about this new sub-variant, Doc?
Well, first, the Centaurus is a sub-variant of Omicron. And I think that's a misnomer calling it Centaurus because it's still a number. And when you have the Omicron is already the name, then under it will be letters and numbers.
So bakit nga pinala? I mean, I get your point because I also got that impression until now that you clarified it na pagka pinangalanan ng ganyan, kumbaga magka-level sila ng Omicron. But you're saying, no, actually sub-variant lang siya of the Omicron sub-variant. Tama po ba yan?
Yeah, Roby, you're correct. No? Because I think the one who named that just want to get the impression that naming it with a specific name will make us remember it. I mean, there are impact in terms of when you remember, like when you say Delta, when you say Alpha. So it's just that the name was that because nothing. It's just, but again, it's something of concern now because he thought that this will be a variant that we are dealing with after the B5 or the BA5.
So ito na yung ngayon, no? Nag-surge. Ito yon, itong Centaurus.
Yes, Luchi, and the prediction is this in the next 2 to 4 weeks, this will now overtake BA5 in most countries, no? Because in just 1 week, from 10 countries, it has been now 15 countries reporting this. And iba, pag ang mutation manggaling sa India, remember the Delta? It's coming from India, no? So it's quite a different sub-variant of Omicron.
Ang problema daw dito, Doc, ito daw yung most immune evasive among the subvariants of the OVB.
Breakthrough infections. But one thing good, and I hope it will be sustained with the effect of vaccine, not a lot are getting to the hospital, but if this is more evasive and more transmissible than BA5, then everyone who got the infection now with the BA5, I hope there will be cross-protection with this BA 2.75.
But Doc, is it the nature of the subvariant itself na mas evasive siya, or are the numbers that we're seeing na going up again also due to the fact that also due to waning immunity and, for that matter, low take-up of booster shots?
Usually when we look at the trend, Robbie, based on experience, the longer the mutation has been with us, like for example from the Alpha, Delta, and then we have the Omicron, you have more mutations. The ability of the virus to put more mutations to evade the human body's immune response is an adaptive capability of the virus. Now the question is, what after this Omicron, because this is still the Omicron. We are not yet off. We're not yet off the Omicron. We're still in the era of Omicron, and this is already the 7th month, and we're now going to September, December, January, February, July, all Omicron. And I hope this will be the end of the Omicron, and I hope nobody follows after Omicron.
How likely is that? I mean, of course, we're always hoping that there will be no new variant or subvariant. But sabi ng OCTA, they're seeing that it might peak down by the middle of August. Is that something to really hope for? And that after that peak, wala na naman, ganyan, or hopefully wala na talaga.
Yeah, hopefully the BA 2.75 will not be able to kick in a lot now, because I would say with some ample protection, because we're already exposed to BA 5, there will still be cross protection antibody that can protect us against the BA 2.75. So there are two scenarios there. It's either we are waiting for another peak between mid of August or until the end of August, or after mid of August, everything will go down gradually.
So, masaya na ang Pasko, sana. I mean, kasi mag-Burr months.
Hopefully. Hopefully.
Pero ayun, kaya ngayon nagkakaproblema, may bago na naman yung Monkeypox, which is already in the Philippines, and may maraming mga kumakalat. Well, I guess it's a misunderstanding which you might want to clear up, no? Marami diyang madikit lang daw sa ganitong tao, sa ganon. Alam niyo naman
Or
dito.
mag-shopping lang daw ng damit.
Oo nga, yun na nga. Pag nagsukat-sukat ka daw ng damit, delikado, maybe you can clear the air for us, doctor.
Yes, so thank you for that. No, first is how does monkeypox get to be transmitted? Number one, the most important mode of transmission is always person to person, close, intimate contact. Okay, when you have a close, intimate contact, either one, you are so close enough, like kissing, cuddling, or even sex, that's close enough. Or the other way is when you're talking with someone that is positive for monkeypox, longer interaction within 3 feet, not just less than 1 minute, 3-5 minutes or more than that, because it's a droplet. When you have a droplet, you have a bigger molecule. So that's why the droplet will just be within 3 feet. And the other part there is the clothing and the linens and the belongings of the patient. So if you're not so careful about it, and then touching those things, and then wiping your mouth, wiping your eyes, then that's another mode of transmission. But again, it's not as contagious as COVID-19, or in terms of infectiousness, especially airborne and COVID-19. This one is close, person-to-person, intimate contact.
Kasama ba sa body fluids yung pawis? Yun ang inaano nung iba na paano daw yung perspiration? Pag nadikit ka doon halimbawa, nagkamot lang kayo, pwede mo ba makuha yun?
No, it's not part. The sweat is not part of that, no. So not to worry about yung makadikit ka lang, no. Ang worry mo is that when you will be talking with the person longer and you're so close to him, then the respiratory droplet is the other mode of transmission.
Doc, I just want to meet those misconceptions head on and be very explicit about that. So you're saying that the intimate contact, gender and sexual orientation is immaterial here. Whether you're male, female, however you identify, lahat tayo susceptible. And the second point I want to clarify, therefore, is to the point about other ways of. So this is also not an STD.
Yes. Okay. First, I would like to explain the first statement. No, this is not a gay, a bisexual, an HIV disease. Okay, anybody will be at risk, whatever you are, as long as you don't practice the health protocol, intimate contact with anybody having the monkeypox, you can get it. Okay, it's just that, no, it's just that. But in today's outbreak, the current outbreak, most of those infected are the gay, bisexuals, or the men who have sex with men, no? And most likely because they have a different health-seeking behavior. They always go in contact with their physician because they have this manner of, and they have skin lesions, they go to the physician. So it could just be that there are more detected in this population. But the problem is we don't know yet. What about the general population? That's one. Second is that it's not sexually transmitted in the sense that when we look at other sexually transmitted infection like HIV, gonococcal infection, or syphilis, data was quoted that it can have visible viral load in the seminal fluid, but even scientists are still thinking, is that level of seminal fluid, can that cause an infection? There's still a question mark on that.
Okay. Oh, sige po.
What about vaccines? Are we looking at acquiring vaccines in order to stem the rise of monkeypox?
Yeah, I think the Department of Health is already in talks with US or WHO in procuring vaccines, no? Because even in rich countries like US and UK, Luchi, no? Nahirapan din sila ng mag-procure ng mga bakuna ngayon, no? And they are their allocation there, their estimate is by the millions of vials because they have a lot of this high-risk population. Mas marami silang high-risk population kasi ang bakunahan dito hindi naman general population eh. Ang babakunahan mo dito yung contacts, yung current contacts ng ongoing human-to-human transmission na wala pang sintomas. Yes, you can give the vaccine within 4 days after exposure. So that's how good the vaccine.
I see. Okay.
And then yung mga high risk, like for example, if I have multiple contacts and I'm one of the high risk, then I have to get the vaccine. So these are the priorities for now.
Mas pareho pala siya ng anti-rabies vaccine, ano? Yung vaccine for monkeypox.
Yes, tama ka, Ame. Yung tawag niyan is post-exposure prophylaxis vaccine.
So meron pang isang report daw kasi nagwo-worry yung mga parents. Pati daw mga children are susceptible to infection. No? It's all ages, no? Everyone is vulnerable.
Yes, I'll give you a scenario. There was one case. He was infected, and he didn't know he was infected. He goes back home, interact with one of their children, and the children got the infection. So it's something like when you go back to your house, household transmission will also be possible.
So anong responsible behavior dyan apart from yung warning nga ng yung advice ng World Health Organization to minimize sexual partners? Pag nakakita ka ng ganyang mga symptoms, medyo clear naman sila sa symptoms, ano? What is the person supposed to do first thing?
First thing first is that you have to isolate yourself. If you suspect that you had that, no? Let's say may risk factor ka, and then you have the skin lesions, you have fever, call the doctor. Have an appointment with the doctor. It's important that the doctor will give the assessment because sa ngayon, Ami, ang referral ngayon, and the doctor sees the patient, he will coordinate with the regional epidemiology surveillance unit or the RESU. Then the RESU will determine if the test is needed. So they will be coordinating on the test and it will be sent to the RITF.
Doc,
How can we distinguish between? How do we distinguish between a normal rash and the skin lesion arising from monkeypox?
That will be now determined by the doctor who will be getting the history, a very extensive history, not only history of travel, also the sexual history, because Ami, Luchi, some of these rashes might also appear like a sexually transmitted infection. So it's important the doctor should be the one. Yeah, so that we need to really emphasize people with symptoms go to the doctor. We need to enhance health-seeking behavior at this point in time and tell them, please go to the doctor, have it assessed rather than leaving it with yourself.
Pero Doc, related dun yung tanong ko eh. Yung early diagnosis, early detection, of course, always important. But how early can you actually detect it? I'm also curious kasi yung mga kumakalat na mga picture ngayon, these are real pictures of monkeypox victims, particularly from other continents. But I don't know, yung bang mga nakikita nating picture na covered yung torso and so on, advanced ba yun? Is that early stage? And what does it look like at the early stages?
That's why there are atypical presentation here because most of the cases, ang unang nakikita, what we call the skin lesions, no? The mucocutaneous lesions. Lesions in the mouth, in the face, and then in the genital area, and even in the extremities, no? So if you had those, then you need to get the epidemiologic link. Where does this lesion came from? Where did I get this? Did I have sexual contact? Did I have travel abroad in the last 21 days? Did I have contact with the one who traveled abroad in the last 21 days? So these are important information to link that if those lesions are exposure to a person that has monkeypox.
Okay, now take me to the frame of mind of somebody who detects these lesions, or maybe is already suspecting. Is probably already thinking to him or herself now baka ito monkeypox, tingnan natin. Sa frame of mind ng taong yon, should he panic? Should he worry? What's the worst case scenario? Kasi iniisip niya, ano bang worst case scenario ko dito?
Well, one is that unlike COVID, mortality here is very, very low. Okay, you don't die because of gasping or lack of air. No, so you really need to compose yourself, and very important, you have to seek the doctor because the doctor will be the one to guide you if this is monkeypox. And at the same time, magandang tanong yan, Roby, no? So that you will not be misinformed also. Pupunta ka sa mga kapitbahay mo or sa mga kaibigan mo, baka ma-stigmatize ka lang. Baka sasabihin, hey, monkeypox na yan, or whatever is that, no? So, pupunta ka doon sa authority na merong alam kung ano yung infection mo. Hindi lang doon sa iba't ibang tao because the more delayed you will seek the consult, the more the stigma, and at the same time, baka magkalat ka na.
Yan din nga tatanong ko, anong klaseng isolation yan? Is it similar to COVID na talagang complete isolation o can you interact with household members? Can you talk kahit malayo lang with your neighbors? Anong klaseng isolation advised?
It's just like what we did with COVID. They should be isolated, okay? There should be no direct contact. Kung magbibigay ng pagkain, they should be in the room and yung pagkain ibibigay lang but you not be in the room a longer period of time. Wear the face mask, wear the gloves, no? Importante yung gloves kasi yung mga things ng mga pasyente na nandun sa room may be also contaminated. And after you come out from that room, you wash your hands, you throw the gloves away, okay? Yung mga beddings niya, yung mga damit niya, you have to separate that and you can wash that, disinfect that, and can also be reused again.
Oh, pero may nabasa ako to that point na mag-gloves ka, ingat ka, pati yung beddings, yung mga damit. May nakita rin ako, sabi, handle your own laundry, handle your own clothes. Paano yun? Pagka nag-isolate ka, at saka by the way, gaano katagal yung isolation, Doc?
21 days. Medyo matagal-tagal, no? As long as you still have that skin lesion, then you're still infectious.
Hanggat hindi nagfo-fall off yung scab, ano? You are infectious.
Yes, tama ka, Ami.
Siyang pulutong.
And those scars
going back to Roby, you can somebody can help you get those clothings or beddings for you, no? As long as pag i-collect niya yan, it should be in a container na hindi naman mag-aerosolize yung mga virus doon sa beddings niya, no? So pwede niyang ilagay sa isang plastic, tapos dalhin niya doon sa laundry niya, then they can wash it there. Basta as long as
hindi naman kailangan mag-PPE yung nag-aayos ng beddings.
Well, as always, mas maganda kung mayroon kang PPE, added layer of protection. But face mask and gloves is very important.
Okay. Yung scars, does that stay? Pagka yung scarring from the scabs and the lesions, is that forever?
No, it will heal also by several weeks after na mag-dry up yung lesions.
Bulutong. Bulutong.
Okay. So, pagka may mga bagong ganito, Doc, we're always concerned about misinformation, disinformation. Do you see the behaviors of Filipinos kahit papaano improving? I mean, we've had to face, a handful of viruses, subvariants, behaviors, and so on. Do you see any improvement in how people are behaving online in terms of, and not just in terms of sharing information, but also how they seek information?
I think we've learned a lot. No? Makikita mo na ngayon sa mga online, unlike yung first year of the pandemic, ang dami talaga mga fake news at saka iba't ibang information. No? Ngayon makikita mo na there are credible, may mga news like ito, mga articles ninyo, other channels or other media or ano. Mukhang yun ang pino-forward na nila ngayon, which is better, no? Talagang meron lang talaga yung mga comments doon na which is sometimes misleading na siguro wag niya lang basahin. Ang basahin na lang kung ano yung mga interview. And I think we've learned, and probably because of you also, you get to expose more experts now in the media and telling what is the situation, what is the correct information, and that helps also a lot.
O last na lang. It's not as dangerous as COVID, but it can still kill, no? Monkeypox. There have been reports of deaths outside the endemic countries.
Yes, I would like to specifically mention those deaths. No? The one that died in India is also an HIV positive. The one who died in Spain is also HIV, and I think there's one. So most of them have also other conditions where their immune system is bad and they already have some type of ailment before they got the monkeypox.
Comorbidity.
Okay. Dr. Rontgene Solante, sir, maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Roby.
Thank you,
Ami.
Doc.
Thank you, Luchi.
And we will start up another conversation after the break. Keep it here on One News.
Bongbong Marcos says his administration has no plans to renew the country's membership in the International Criminal Court.
The ICC is a very different kind of a court. Kaya pinag-aralan muna, sinabi ko sa inyo, pag-aralan nyo na mabuti yung procedure para tama yung gagawin natin. Kasi hindi natin, siyempre, kailangan baka ma-misinterpret yung ating mga ginagawa.
One human rights expert sees no surprise in the Marcos administration's decision not to rejoin the International Criminal Court.
Cooperation is ideal, but it is not something that will derail an investigation.
Okay.
When the Philippine government, got out of the ICC, that doesn't mean the ICC no longer has jurisdiction of the cases in the Philippines that were committed when it was a member. The ICC right now remains as the only viable avenue for victims of the drug war to pursue justice. And the decision by the President Marcos to not rejoin the ICC, while it is not relevant to the investigation itself, that prolongs their wait for justice.
Welcome back. The Chiefs. The International Criminal Court probing the country's war on drugs is still a hot topic. Weighing in, President Marcos' private legal counsel and also a lawyer to former President Rodrigo Duterte. Good evening, Attorney Harry Roque.
Good
Yes,
evening, Attorney Harry.
I'm also the counsel of President Duterte now.
Oh, yun nga. Itatanong ko, Attorney Harry, maybe clarify muna your qualifications, the number of hats that you're wearing relevant to this matter, yung engagement po with President Marcos on the one hand, and your engagement with President Rodrigo Roa Duterte.
Well, the engagement with President Marcos has to do with the fact that when I'm called for consultations, I'm normally the only non-government person in the room. No? Everyone else is a member of the cabinet and covered by executive privilege. So actually, the client-attorney relation is to ensure confidentiality whenever I'm invited to meetings with the chief executive to discuss legal matters. Whereas President Duterte, well, I do represent him in this possible investigation because I would like to stress that right now, President Duterte, former President Duterte, is not facing any preliminary investigation. What is being conducted is a preliminary investigation on the drug war.
Okay. Sige. So let's get into that. Sinabi ni President Marcos, I have no plans to go back to the ICC. But we also heard him say that, pero pag-aralan natin. Let's be careful. Let's be circumspect. Just curious, as an international law expert yourself, maybe you could clarify this thing for us first also. Membership is one thing, being party to the treaty is one thing. Cooperation is another matter altogether. In other words, is there a space here where the government can say that we are not party to the treaty? On the other hand, they can either have the option or even be perhaps on a certain level be obligated to cooperate? Is there a space like that here?
Speaking as an academic and as an advocate of international criminal law, when you become a party to the Rome Statute, you're under the obligation to cooperate for the period of time that you were in fact a party to the treaty. The duty to cooperate ceases after you terminate or after you leave the treaty, but for everything that happened during the time when you were under or a member of the treaty, then you have a duty to cooperate. The problem with international law is even if you don't cooperate, even if you are theoretically in breach of a treaty, now what?
Kaya nga. So, we'll get to that.
And in the case of the ICC, service of summons, service of warrants depend on the cooperation of the state.
I see.
Having said that, President Duterte, it was his idea, said that if and when the ICC persists in their investigation and should there be a warrant of arrest issued, he will go to the Philippine Supreme Court and challenge that order because according to him, the exercise of jurisdiction is a violation of our treaty obligation because we became a member of the treaty only on the condition that the ICC would be a court of absolute last resort and not a court of first instance. And he's confident the Supreme Court will in fact rule that the only instance when the ICC can exercise jurisdiction when domestic courts are unable or unwilling, he is pretty much confident that the Supreme Court will not admit that Philippine courts are unable or unwilling.
Paano kung yung interpretation ng unable is relative? Sasabihin yun because that's what the ICC is saying eh. Well, the complainants in the ICC are saying na yun nga, hindi daw umuusad yung mga investigation dito. And will that satisfy that inability to investigate?
Well, fortunately, we have a travaux préparatoires, or the intentions of the countries that entered into the treaty. When we say unable, it is because there is no functioning state. If you look at the caseload of the ICC, most of the cases happened in Sudan. And we all know that there's no functioning government in Sudan. There's simply no courts that could prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes against international law, which is not the case here in the Philippines. When we say a country is unwilling, again, the travaux is very clear that there is a statute providing for impunity, which we don't have in the Philippines because presidents only have immunities while in office. And in fact, in our recent history, 2 presidents were jailed immediately after they left office. No? And so we're confident that on the basis of the intention of the Philippines when we ratified the ICC Rome Statute, as well as intention of all those who became members and all those who did not become members, including the United States, Russia, and China, that the intention was never to allow the ICC to be a substitute to domestic legal proceedings.
So what do you think is their basis for proceeding with the prosecution? Anong nila, may prima facie ba sila for saying that the courts are not functioning as they should? Anong ginagamit nilang basehan for saying, no, we will proceed? Because that essentially is what's their decision, right, to prosecute.
Yeah. Simply put, politics. The former prosecutor was an African, and she was heavily criticized by her fellow Africans to the point that the entire African Union is now threatening to leave the island. To a point, she decided, okay, I'll start an investigation against a non-African. Unfortunately, it was President Duterte. Now, I'd like to underscore that what she, in fact, did was a preliminary examination. At that point, we're not talking of probable cause. We're only talking about good reasons to proceed to preliminary investigation, but she did it with a splash because she had a political motivation. She wanted to assure African nations that she was not just running after Africans, because at that point in time, she was in fact only investigating African nationals, not a single one from outside Africa at that time. But of course, there's been, she started preliminary examination against the Brits or the Iraq. She later on came up with the conclusion that she should not investigate because the domestic institutions in Britain are investigating. She had preliminary examination in Colombia, but that has since been concluded after Colombia agreed to cooperate with the prosecutor, and the prosecutor said, fine, go ahead with your domestic investigations, and if you need help, we'll give you assistance.
Attorney,
But what about
Attorney, kanina you made a distinction between, okay, you can look at it, we have obligations, particularly as applied to the period when we were a party to the treaty and also with respect to alleged violations during that time that we were a party. And then you said, but then there's the practicalities of it. Cooperation will have to be necessary and so on. So leaving aside the practicalities and the pragmatics as to whether or not the ICC actually has any compelling power here, if and when President Duterte does challenge a warrant by the ICC and go to the Supreme Court, doesn't he also run the risk of the Supreme Court then saying, well, as Harry Roque himself acknowledged in the Chiefs, we had obligations that the state signed on to pertaining to the time when those violations were allegedly committed, and that overlaps with the time when very clearly we were a party to the treaty. Doesn't the President also, or President Duterte also run that risk of the Supreme Court basically affirming what you said?
Yes, of course. But you see, what makes the ICC different is that in order to convince doubting states such as the United States that the court will not be a substitute for domestic legal proceedings, they came up with what is known as admissibility. Meaning, even if the court has jurisdiction over subject matter, it will still not exercise its jurisdiction unless there is a showing that domestic legal institutions are unable or unwilling. So I always have to distinguish for everyone, and this is not just for the general public, but even for Filipino lawyers, that in the ICC there's a distinction between jurisdiction and admissibility. Even if jurisdiction is present, it is still subject to a treaty obligation of admissibility. No? That jurisdiction cannot be exercised without a clear showing that domestic institutions are not working full stop. Because no state ever intended to surrender their sovereignty and jurisdiction in favor of an international criminal court.
No, but Attorney Roque, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you yourself contemplated and at certain points was even tantalized by the notion or the possibility of these mechanisms existing side by side and being applied even within the court. You wrote in your own blog, for example, things that will have to improve in our justice systems. You said an agency, among other things, most likely like the DOJ, would have to be identified, tasked to cooperate with the ICC in this regard. The Supreme Court, you contemplated, since the ICC would be exercising judicial power in the Philippines. First, I have to say, a possibility that I never thought would be possible, would have to amend its own rules. Now, I don't know if those rules were ever actually put in place, but you yourself contemplated that, if I'm reading it right. You yourself contemplated that. You yourself sounded excited by that prospect.
Yes. Well, that is why I think the positive thing that will come out of this investigation of the ICC is that our courts, the executive, the police, civil society, and the jails, the pillars of the criminal justice system, have to come together to make the system work better. I never said that this the Philippine legal system is perfect. Yes, we convicted the Ampatuans for 57 counts of murder, but to me, it is unacceptable that it took 10 years. Yes, we convicted Pemberton, but I never considered it was a perfect prosecution because we never laid hands on the person of Pemberton while he was being investigated. No? So the system is far from perfect. But Roby, always look at the caseload of the ICC where they actually exercise jurisdiction. It's cases of failed states. One thing good is because of this investigation, we will be compelled to examine our institutions with the end view of improving it. And of course, I agree that we have to improve. In fact, when I ran for the Senate, that was one of my platforms. I wanted, number one, to hasten prosecution by adopting inquisitorial system, which basically is the system that they have in the ICC, being a European institution. No? It is the prosecutor that procures the evidence and not the police. No? Number two, I wanted a victims compensation fund, which is patterned after the ICC. So I'm not saying that this prosecution is all bad in the sense that it challenges us to do better, but because of admissibility and our treaty consent that we will only recognize the ICC as a court of last resort, I believe they should not exercise jurisdiction. And I think eventually, no less than the court or the Philippine Supreme Court will uphold this position.
Okay, what if the ICC insists on proceeding with the investigation and then our Supreme Court stops them and the ICC still continues? Is that scenario possible, and what will happen then?
Never, because in the first place, like any other criminal court, not only do they need to have jurisdiction over the subject matter, they need to have jurisdiction over the person of the accused. Now, the ICC has no policeman, and they rely on the cooperation of state parties. It is still incumbent upon the Philippine National Police to enforce the warrant, which may or may not be issued by the ICC, but this came from President Duterte himself. He will file for injunction against the PNP from enforcing the writ. And I think this is a brilliant move because on the part of the Marcos administration, no one can say that they are in breach of their treaty obligation to cooperate because it is no less than a judicial ruling of the Philippine Supreme Court that would prevent compliance or that would prevent cooperation. But that idea really came from President Duterte, to give him credit. It didn't come from me.
Attorney attended the meeting on the ICC, no? And after that, the senator said they might talk to the president to make him reconsider his decision against the Philippines rejoining the ICC. Is that decision final?
You know, unless the prosecutor stops this charade of a prosecution, I don't think it's possible. Because no state, as I said, would ever agree to surrender their exclusive right to prosecute crimes that happen in their jurisdiction. This is why the United States never joined the ICC. This is why Russia and China never joined the ICC, because despite all the novelties that the drafters of the statute came up, such as a pretrial chamber, no, they were not convinced.
Can I, Attorney Roque, can I take on another take on that? Because when countries, when states signed on to be a treaty, on a certain level they didn't they? On a certain level, every time when they signed on to an international treaty, in spirit, did they not in essence say that on a universal level, we subscribe to these, not only to these values, but to the mechanisms prescribed here? I think a more accurate thing to say is no country or no state or no leader will admit to it when it happens to them. But the state did, in fact, the state represented not just by the leaders, but by their, in our case, by our Congress, by our Senate, ratifying it. The representatives of the people did say, we subscribe to those values, we subscribe to those principles, we will subscribe to the mechanisms prescribed there. But I will admit, it's a totally different thing when it finally happens to one of your own and one of your leaders being brought to justice. That's the only time when the state says, well, wait a minute, we're not a failed state.
But you see, that consent is subject to that peculiar mechanism that we have in the court, which is the principle of complementarity. Simply put, countries agree to be a member of the court, to recognize the jurisdiction of the court, but only as being complementary to domestic jurisdictions, never as a court of first instance, never as a court of primary jurisdiction.
Pero the fact that former Justice Secretary Menardo Guevara actually presented to the UN itself that there was going to be an effort to investigate, to look into these drug cases, but a year or so after that, the investigations pretty much came to nothing. And as a matter of fact, if anything, they confirmed what many thought to be, set up, mounted, staged killings. No? So I think that was a major trigger to ICC resuming its own investigations. But wasn't that in effect a failed exercise that invited ICC's attention all over again? Would you admit to that?
Let's just say that they were not impressed. And that was the conclusion of the prosecutor. But that's the prosecutor talking. No? That is still subject to the decision of the pretrial chamber. And the pretrial chamber, of course, will recognize the principle of complementarity. But come on, let's not engage in nitpicking here. No? We talk about delay. How long has it been since the prosecutor started the preliminary examination on the drug war? It's been more than 2 years also. So it's not a very quick institution as well. There are delays, whether you file it in the Philippine legal system or in the ICC. There will be expense, but I can assure you, there will be more delays if it were to be prosecuted in the ICC. It would be more expensive because you would have to fly in investigators and witnesses to testify before the court. So it is not a speedier remedy for those whose rights have been violated. I will repeat, it's not a perfect system, but we could improve. But ultimately, courts worldwide always have primary jurisdiction, and no state to their own statute ever contemplated surrendering this primary jurisdiction unless the courts are not working.
But Attorney Roque, you yourself, again, contemplating the impacts of being a party to the ICC, you yourself contemplated even factoring in delays, diba? And you took out the element of delay. Just inaction, you said, could subject a national leader to be the subject of a criminal prosecution under the principles of superior responsibility. You said For example, you just the example of Pinoy, not as a perpetrator, but just as somebody who fails to act. You said if President Aquino fails to prosecute and punish the perpetrators of widespread killings, he himself may be subject to criminal prosecution. That does not does not talk about any delay. That does not talk about the principle of sovereignty. It completely recognizes what we signed on to with the ICC.
Correct, but that's also found in our Philippine law, in the national IHL law, no? Which was enacted also by Philippine Congress. And of course, the principle that you just read is a decision of the Philippine Supreme Court, no less. So that principle is now known as the principle of international criminal responsibility, and that is no one can claim immunity from prosecution for the commission of an international wrongful act. But that should be prosecuted in Philippine courts.
Yes, but that's precisely my question.
Even without a domestic law, the Philippine Supreme Court prosecuted Yamashita for war crimes, even in absence of domestic statute, saying that customary international law is sufficient. But where was the trial conducted? In the Philippines.
Yes, but of course, I'm quoting this strictly from your blog entry.
Yes, you are quoting, but out of context.
No, but this is but this is the context.
The national IHL law provides for the exact same thing.
I understand, but this whole passage
go to the ICC.
Yeah, I understand, and I may be out of context, but just to be clear, when I read this passage, the entire context of what you wrote is in the context of what's possible under the ICC and what you were ruling as the unfortunate limitations of the ICC. So, for example, the immediate sentence after what I read. I'm sorry, because
I will repeat it. What you're quoting is even a decision of the Philippine Supreme Court. What you're quoting is a provision of a Philippine law. So what I'm saying is, yes, there should be prosecution, but now there is a national IHL law, which of course came earlier than our ratification of the Rome Statute. As someone who pushed for the national IHL law, we intended that, in fact, to be a substitute for the ICC.
Okay.
And that is why you still insist, countries will still insist on primary jurisdiction for domestic legal systems, particularly in the Philippines, where we have the exact same law being implemented by the ICC.
Okay, and if I am quoting this out of context, I apologize. But let me just then therefore read the next sentence, just to be clear that from my understanding, your context here was the ICC. You said,
what's the point?
No,
I'm going to ask you, what's the point?
No, I'm trying to get... My point is
your point is it is subject to primary domestic jurisdiction. We are not saying that people should not be prosecuted for criminal acts. They should. But when domestic courts are functioning, then it should be domestic courts. That is the essence of sovereignty. That is the essence of jurisdiction. That is why the United States never joined, because they would never accept a situation such as what we have in the Philippines, where a non-elected prosecutor obviously created political havoc or attempted to create political havoc against a sitting head of state.
Okay, my point was I'm trying to get to understand also your international law expertise and perspective at the time that you were championing the ICC. That's my point. Because here you said that he may self be subject of a criminal prosecution. You're saying, no, that's also the principle in our laws. That's appreciated.
Yes.
But the very next sentence, you say, just to be clear also, to be transparent with our audience, the very next sentence is, unfortunately, the court, referring to the International Court, can only exercise its jurisdiction prospectively from November 1 of this year. My only point here is that passage you wrote in the context of the ICC, not the laws that are, not the principles that are also reflected in our laws, which I do not deny.
Well, of course, that is subject matter jurisdiction. No criminal law can apply retroactively. So what I said was 100% accurate. The Rome Statute applies only to acts committed prospectively from the time a country becomes a member of the ICC. There's nothing inaccurate about that.
So you're saying the offense is covered, that the ICC can prosecute. We can also prosecute in the Philippines, but it has to be the Supreme Court.
No, it's regional trial courts, because
regional
the Supreme Court is only a trier of law. No, you cannot make the Supreme Court a trier of facts. It is the regional trial courts. And that is why in the IHL law, the Supreme Court, and it has not done so, is duty-bound to designate special IHL courts in areas where there are ongoing armed conflict. Now, the Rome Statute punishes war crimes committed in international armed conflicts and serious violations of Common Article 3, which is applicable to non-international armed conflict. And that is why we have had a number of convictions for under the IHL law, which are the exact same crimes cognizable by the ICC. So the fact that we have convicted individuals in Marawi for violating IHL law proves that domestic courts are able and willing, in fact, implementing the exact same law that the ICC is implementing.
Can you cite an example in Marawi?
Yes.
What year? Around what year?
We have had a conviction for sexual slavery. We have had a conviction for recruitment of children as combatants, both in Marawi. If I'm not mistaken, we have about 6 or 8 convictions already in Marawi alone.
And affirmed by the higher courts? They were affirmed already?
I'm not sure if they have been affirmed or even if they have been appealed, no? But I know these facts because I had to train DOJ prosecutors on the nuances of the law, particularly on how to establish the existence of an armed conflict, no? And of course, there are additional elements required, no? That the acts be committed in the context of an armed conflict. So that's something that we have no experience in proving, no? Basically, no? And it's easier to prove domestic crimes, an instance murder, rather than war crimes because there's an additional element to prove in war crimes, no?
Okay, what is the downside of our now not being a member if indeed that's where it's going?
Well, if something happens, and in our political history, we have had political turmoil. If for any reason we don't have a functioning government, and of course we have been under occupation during World War II, and the domestic courts are not functioning, then there will be no tribunal that can punish the most serious crimes. And that is why I really advocated for the creation of the ICC, not only because we've been a theater to armed conflict, not only because there was a time when domestic courts did not function under an armed conflict, but also because we contributed so much jurisprudence that enabled the court to come into existence. Yung tinatawag na command responsibility is also made in the Philippines. Can you imagine? Yung pinaka-importanting prinsipyo that an individual incurs criminal responsibility for violating the Geneva Conventions, which is applicable only between states as a treaty, is an international precedent which even predated Nuremberg. That was Inra Yamashita. And please read the decision in Kuroda in such beautiful language written by Justice Perfecto on why customary international law is sufficient legal basis to prosecute individuals, because in the absence of domestic code on war crimes, which only came about under the national IHL law, the Japanese generals were of course saying nudum crimen nulla poenat sine lege, but the court, particularly Kuroda, was brilliant in saying that since ancient times, we've recognized the binding nature of IHL because it's important to our values as human beings.
Yeah. Attorney Roque, one final question on the nature and the binding and lasting, hopefully, institutions of treaties in particular. President Duterte pulled us out of a treaty that you worked very hard for us to be party to. There was this whole conversation about the Senate, having had to ratify a treaty, and then therefore the question of, does the Senate need to concur as well when we pull out of a treaty? Where do you stand on that now? I mean, considering how long you fought for that treaty and how at the end of the day it was so easy to just render it as nothing to the country.
Of course, I was sad. I will admit I was sad. But I thought the decision was justified because really that former prosecutor was politicking. She should have picked on another country, not us. Why? Because we were the most active in campaigning for universal ratification of the Rome Statute in Asia. Actually, I had a conversation with her. And I told her, with what you did, do you think there's any other Asian country that will join the ICC? Certainly, no other country in ASEAN will join the ICC because precisely they fear that the ICC will interfere with sovereignty and jurisdictions, and that's exactly what happened. So that is why I have said it, and I will say it again. Should they persist in the prosecution of this case with people knowing the kind of legal system that we have, knowing that it was our jurisprudence that enabled the very establishment of this court, no one would believe that our courts are not able and willing to handle these cases, particularly when we have a domestic law penalizing the exact same things being penalized by the ICC Rome Statute. Countries, in fact, will not join the ICC. And I said that.
Yeah, but
I spoke in the General Assembly of the state parties prior to the decision to withdraw. But of course, they thought that was just probably words. They did not know that was actually the message of the president. So it came with a warning that you are going to lose your most important ally in Asia, which is the Philippines.
But apart
But
from
which ASEAN country is part of the ICC?
Cambodia, Timor-Leste.
But apart from countries not joining, doesn't our actions, both President Duterte and the Philippines, essentially of pulling out after a case or an issue was brought before the ICC, doesn't it also set a precedent or develop a template for any nation in the world who are parties to the ICC to say that, that's the easy out. That's the easy way to do it. And again, I'm asking you as somebody who fought hard for this treaty. I'm asking you for somebody who knows how flimsy and yet how powerful these international treaties can be.
Well, it's not an easy way out because states, I reiterate, never agreed to surrender their sovereignty and jurisdiction. They never did. But what they did to the Philippines is now one major reason why the entire African Union is about to leave the ICC. And that's how important the decision on the Philippine investigation is. EU is looking at us. Many countries of Asia that initially wanted to join backed out. Malaysia, for instance, backed out. They wanted to join, and after what happened to President Duterte, they decided to back out. So it was a former prosecutor responsible for destroying the universal campaign for ratification of the ICC by doing what countries feared the most: interference when their domestic courts are not functioning. Did you hear anyone complaining about the court exercising jurisdiction in Sudan? No, because everyone knew there were no courts in Sudan functioning. And that is why it is important to have an ICC. When there are no courts, victims should always have a recourse somewhere. Now, can anyone actually say that victims in the Philippines do not have a legal recourse? I convicted the killers of the 57 victims of Maguindanao massacre. Difficult, but doable. Pemberton, I was up against a Philippine government that was siding with the Americans because they were protecting the VFA. We still convicted. This Evangelista case, until now it's pending. It's been more than 10 years. Because the only evidence that we have is, a skull and nothing else. But it's still in court. And we're still hearing it and still hoping for a conviction, It's not difficult to convict. And that is why the last time I was in Krame, you have to collaborate with the police in making a case build-up because sometimes the police want shortcuts, which will not stand in court. But you have got to do what has to be done, difficult as it is. And there is simply no substitute to this because you do the same thing even in the ICC.
Okay, Attorney Harry Roque, maraming salamat po.
Maraming
Thank you,
salamat po.
Attorney.
Thank you, Harry.
Bye.
And that's it for the Chiefs. We hope what was discussed will keep the conversation going. Ako po si Roby Alampay.
I'm Ami Pamintuan of the Philippine Star.
I'm Luchi Cruz-Valdes of News 5.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.